Blair, thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview. I feel quite excited about what is ahead of us. Can you start, please, by telling the listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yes, my name is Blair Simpson. I'm primarily a creative. I have skills in character and creature design, sculpture, prop making, advanced model building, digital design, silicone and latex molding and casting. I also have skills in performing arts, so I can do some voice impressions for you if you like, and laser cut product design. Your listeners can have a look at my work on my website, which is www.bartymaker, that's B-A-R-T-Y, maker.com. And they'll see both my work and, more importantly, my students' work over the last 4 years.
Because it's impressive, isn't it? I have had a look at your website. It's
Thank
really,
you. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I've loved it, and I've just seen so much ability in young people. I just want to talk about it.
Well, I wish you were around when we were homeschooling.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Blair, earlier we were talking about how a subject such as art, with the exception of fine arts in a school curriculum, can be dropped by parents and sometimes the students as they're preparing for university or focusing on their career, which seems to imply to me that creative art is seen as unimportant or only for fun. How would you explain to parents of homeschooled teens why it is important to include strategic sculpting in their curriculum?
That's a really good question. I have encountered that still a lot in the education system. In part, it surprises me because, we're in a nation that's had a phenomenal journey in terms of creative industries. And, I often say to people, you wouldn't believe what New Zealand was in 1985 compared to what it is now. What I would say to them is, even in corporate roles, and corporations say this, HR departments say this, we need creative people. We need people who can think outside the box. And it's as much about modes of thinking and being as it is about the activity itself. And an example of that is that a big break for me in the corporate world came when I was 40. And I still have encountered that, of course, in both middle schools and high schools, as parents don't want their children to do art, and especially for NCEA. And I think that's a massive missed opportunity because of the fact that when we create with our hands especially, we enter new modes of thinking and being, and new modes, from what I've seen in my students, new modes of brain development, okay? And it's transferable to other fields of life. And if your child is particularly interested in something as well, try and embrace it. And that's where art gives you the opportunity to do that. So, for instance, if your student is really into, say, Disney characters or Disney films, you've got a whole opportunity for them to have a go at sculpting a Disney face, making some objects from the story that they're really into. Because people look at what I do and they go, oh, that's very nice. He gets the kids to make things in clay and make models, and that's lovely. But actually, sculpture and model making and building with the hands is a profound visual and kinesthetic learning activity. That's already been proven. So there's a guy in the States called John Zahurek who has something called the Anatomy in Clay Learning System. It's massively successful across thousands of classrooms in the United States, medical and veterinary classrooms, not art classrooms. And so it proves that if you want to deeply learn something, forming it with your hands is a profound way to do it.
We're thinking then about students who would be contemplating a future in sciences, physics perhaps,
absolutely,
medicine or design. It's really important, therefore, that this opportunity of sculpting could enhance. How can you take that thought a little bit more and explain to the parents why they should keep that for their students who are heading into those fields?
Yeah, it's about deep connection as well to the content. So, for instance, if we look at what's happening in science and in medicine and everything else, what are the technologies that are being used? Well, we're seeing a lot of 3D modeling, we're seeing a lot of scanning, we're seeing a lot of additive manufacturing processes, which are just set to explode. I mean, they're 3D printing metal already, engine parts, they're 3D printing houses, or experimenting to do so, 3D printing concrete. This is the technology, along with subtractive manufacturing, which goes into something called CNC 5-axis modeling, which is another expensive machine. Those two technologies are going to explode. So having a deep connection visually and kinesthetically to what you're doing is a profound skill. My wife is a civil engineer, and she is highly, highly valued in every office she stepped into because she's so good at designing and drawing the content. There are other engineers who never really got into drawing and did the diplomas or the degrees, but because they're not so connected to the nuts and bolts, if you like, of engineering, they can't offer that. And I think that's something that just gets overlooked. I mean, we got rid of technical drawing in the school curriculum, and I actually thought it was a big mistake. I got so much from technical drawing way back in the 80s and 90s.
So the sculpting that we're talking about, though, is building on that kind of drawing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Would you then suggest to the high school students looking for a future in it that they're both important? Don't drop the drawing in favour of the sculpting, don't drop the sculpting in favour of the drawing because
Absolutely.
of the way the modern world...
I have something to add to that. Like a lot of what I've done in schools and with private students over the last few years is interpreting drawings. We take it for granted, those of us that can do it, but being able to look at a blueprint, at an orthographic projection, and understand and think in 3D, and then move that into a three-dimensional model, say an architectural model or an accurate sculpture of a character head. These are skills that can just be completely neglected and never develop. But my observation in most children and young people is that they're there and they should be nurtured.
That certainly seems to be what I recall from the school system. Art was recognised as something that was important for young children, but as time goes by, it's definitely dropped. It's seen as the unimportant subject, and certainly as a serious student, why would you? So that's what I'm hoping that we do today, is reintroduce to homeschooling families that have yet to grasp that vision, that their opportunity to homeschool gives them this gift of being able to choose this for their students because they can, and you're telling them why. So you quoted earlier, the mind cannot forget what the hands have learned. As a concept, homeschoolers get that. First of all, tell me where that quote comes from, and then can you please explore, apart from art curricula that they may already have exposure to, and the above benefits that we've already mentioned in science, medicine, design, how could sculpture assist in, say, teaching maths to students with divergent learning abilities, or any student actually, but especially those who find the traditional approaches difficult? So I want to know where you got that quote from, and then explore it with that.
The quote comes actually from the Anatomy and Clay learning system, John Zahurik in the States, and I do encourage your listeners to look that up because it's incredibly impressive. So anatomyandclay.com. Now, John is not a medical professional or medical educator. He taught artistic anatomy for 25 years, and he's then turned that skill in art into this learning system for things that are unrelated to art except as a means to an end. And so when I think about, say, for instance, diverse learners and mathematics, there's a few things I've done over the last few years that I thought were quite powerful. And one of those is you take something that they're really interested in, and this is key. So let's say, for instance, that's Viking longships and medieval ships, okay? They might have seen Vikings, well, hopefully they haven't seen Vikings on TV, but, they would have seen something. And so when you do that, because I like to foster a real love of knowledge in my students, because I have a love of knowledge. And so you can start by looking at the designs of these ships. How did those work in terms of what it could do? And it doesn't sound like maths yet, but I'm getting there. One activity that's great to start with is build a scale model. It doesn't have to be an amazing model. You can do it in clay. There's lots of clays available. And it's nice to shape stuff in and then put it in the oven. But there's a lot of measurement involved in scale. And you can move that into things like, okay, let's measure the length. Let's measure the width. What about the volume? Are those relationships linear, or is there a different relationship going on there? In fact, you could do two scale models, one in a certain size and one larger, and then do that. Now, that's touching on maths, but then you can flow from maths into, say, cultural heritage. So I was telling a student the other day about Viking longship and Germanic culture, longship burials. Then led on to, why do bronze swords survive in the earth when we dig them out thousands of years later? And why do iron swords rust away? So there's all sorts of directions you can go on, and I'm not a big fan of siloing subjects, especially for diverse learners. They have a hunger and an interest in the content. Keep them on the content that they love and use it to flow a conversation out into different subjects, different learning areas. You mentioned also, one more thing I should mention about that. So for instance, one of the objects that's fantastic for maths is the globe theatre. You can take the cylinder shapes and then get into volumes of cylinders. You can take the cuboids, the triangle prisms, and then get into volumes and measurements of those, formula for those volumes. And going back to ships, there's a whole other conversation that is both science and maths, which is displacement. So one of the questions I love to ask students is, well, why does a ship float? And sometimes they'll say, oh, because it's light. I'll say, well, that steel container ship out there isn't light. Why is it floating? And how do we look at that? And then you move into Archimedes and you move into displacement, measuring displacement. So I've found that an organic model, and this is especially with the diverse learners that I've worked with, having that organic conversation. And if we look back to the Greeks, it was the sitting around the teacher, having organic philosophical conversations about things that really mattered. It wasn't talking at them for half an hour and giving them photocopies. And that's where I think the gold is, and I've seen the gold.
Or a textbook.
Exactly. And that's where I really respect that parents take control. They know they can meet the needs of their child and have their child on a beautiful journey of knowledge. It leads to wonderful places.
I'm going to hop in just here because you've just touched on something that is something I try to encourage homeschool mums to do. It's very common, especially in the early years, that they lack the confidence, especially if they feel their own education was insufficient. And it might take some time to realise that they can be set free from the potential tyranny of the dreaded photocopies or the textbook, and they are your master. But we homeschool for different reasons. If you want to be controlled by textbooks, go to school. Recognising the child's passion and let that be the guide for their education, and then pull in what you can to support that. In this case, we're talking, how does sculpting serve that process? So thank you for encouraging the mothers, because people like me can bang on about it all the time, but they need others who have been in that sector as well to reassure them that yes, let go of your trust and dependence on books and just trust your innate child's capabilities.
Well, I have a testimony about that with my student that I work with very closely.
Please do.
So at the time I met him, he was really struggling. ASD, ADHD, some real bullying behaviours. He was fortunate enough to be in a school that had a really great model and a unique curriculum, project-based learning, but he wasn't really doing a lot. But when he was in my class, because I was teaching art and technology at the time, one of this brilliant manager, you have those people in education that are just gold, and you have so much respect for them, and then you think, gosh, if only they had designed this from the ground up. But a manager I have huge respect for, and still a friend, said to me, she was principal at the time, she said, oh, why don't you get him to do a Lord of the Rings sword, because he's really into Lord of the Rings. So I worked out a way to make, and I still use this, it ended up growing into making full-size swords that feel like a real sword in the hand but have a safe blade. But we started quite small with a small sword, and then from there we built a relationship, and then he wanted to do Isengard, so we did the Tower of Isengard. And because I had this skill set of materials and ways of making things, I could really connect with him. His parents ended up hiring me to work with him privately. I've worked with him for 3 years, at least 5 hours a week, one-on-one. Often, especially during the lockdown, up to 30 hours a week, one-on-one. And we have become great friends. He has become a real blessing in my life. But the change I have seen in him, because I let him run with what he loved, and his parents, and I honour their decision, they let him run with what he loved. He was into fantasy and Dungeons and Dragons, so we built, and I showed him how to make beautiful dioramas in terrain. He's really interested in history and World War One and World War Two. So we started making dioramas of World War Two battle scenes with, realistic buildings and things like that. And now you might think, oh, that's nice, but how's that going to help him get a job? It's about that confidence and those sources of self-esteem. He's gained more and more confidence through his interaction with me. We've been able to sit down and talk for 3 hours about everything: the world, the global economy, history, society, where things are going, the future, technology. And so now he's blossomed. I mean, there was a time when he was not expected to be able to settle into a school at all. He was never expected, and now he's at a good school in Auckland, Central Auckland, and he is going to do NCA Level 1 music because guess what? It turns out he's turned himself over the last year into a great guitarist. He's really good. So he's probably going to get an excellence in music. In the time I've worked with him, his maths has turned around. He's getting good grades in that. And in English, his writing has probably improved a lot. It's not amazing. But my point is that letting the kids do what they love, you're giving them positive experiences that will turn eventually into sources of self-esteem and feelings of, wow, I am good at that. And if you let them have a lot of freedom, they will surprise you. This was never expected of this young man.
Because we have many homeschoolers who their entry into homeschooling was because their parents recognised that they were not settling into the traditional. Let's back the proverbial truck up, because you mentioned making a sword, was it, based on Lord of the Rings. So one of my questions that I had prepared for you was, what ideas can you give parents and students for utilising this amazing sculpting opportunity with the literature they may have prepared for their children, and so linking it into at least 2 subject materials? Can you talk about how one supports the other and give some practical ideas, bearing in mind that some parents get a glimpse of the idea, but their next question to a creative person is, yeah, but what? Please help them out.
No problem at all. Yeah, well, I think, creative arts are a great opportunity to explore literature in a meaningful way. And that can be character-based. If you've got a child, you'd be surprised what some even 7 and 8-year-olds can do in the right clays. And I'll talk a little bit about those in a moment, just so your listeners at home can say, oh, that's the clay I want to get. Okay. Then it can be object-based, so for instance, a sword. Maybe you're doing Sting from Lord of the Rings, for example, right? Or it can be architecture-based, and those projects can be more challenging. But the other thing I should mention here, of course, we've never had a better age to work out, if you're fully committed, to work out how to do things. So YouTube, right? So if you want to know how to make an architectural model, and I would encourage you to use most likely foam board. It's not great for the environment, but it's amazing for creatives. So if you get foam board and you cut it right, and you can look up how to make anything. I've made a Roman temple out of foam board that looked amazing. If they make Roman, or let's say even a Greek Bronze Age dagger, there's different cultural elements as well, of course. But then we've got, there's science, like I mentioned before, metallurgy, right? Why is one made of bronze? Why is one made of iron or steel? Cultural heritage in terms of history, what was the sword to a Viking? Because kids will often have no context around that at all. This was the most expensive thing that a man could own, far more expensive than his house, probably even than a small ship, because if you look at those swords, the amount of craftsmanship and value that's gone into that. And then, of course, we can go on to say, all right, well, we know the Vikings were pagans, and obviously, being pagans, they did what they did, and they raided places and, did some not very nice things. But how is it that then the sword was still something that was a place, something of honor in the Christian era? All right, and it was a cruciform sword. So there's all these connections you can make. If you give your child the time and the materials and you find the techniques, they will very often deliver. And that's where the gold is. That's where the magic happens.
And the time. You gave them the time.
Absolutely. You can't really inspire young people and engage them by talking at them for half an hour and then giving them something to look at on a screen or a photocopy. And that's where, for me, my dream is to totally turn that around on some level.
I'm thinking of an author that homeschoolers are probably familiar with, we certainly with. She excels in historical fiction. It's Rosemary Sutcliffe. Our children read some of her work. So she wrote, some of her books were based in the Roman era in Britain, but also I'm just thinking of like your sword or your dagger or whatever. And that they found them in not architectural, what do you call them?
Archaeological digs.
Thank you.
Yeah.
For the parent who's looking for justification to make themselves feel better or not guilty about allowing, especially an older child, to pursue the sculpting, if that's what they need to like remove that sense of pressure and guilt, I would say absolutely find someone who is going to help you, like Blair, to get your dagger or your made if it's metal, or to work something in the sculpting. How would you advise them to work with their own resources?
Yeah. Firstly, in terms of them doing it independently, I'll describe a few of these things. So there's an amazing clay that everyone should know about. Okay, it's relatively expensive, but it's not that expensive if you're making a prop. The clay is called Chavant, and it's made in France. So that's Chavant. So Chavant is what's called an oil-based clay. If you're going to make yourself, say, a Greek dagger, what I do first is I take a drawing of that dagger and I make a core out of a flat material. A good material, funnily enough, is NCEA folio board that's used for art education system. The beautiful thing with the NCEA folio board is it's thick, strong, a large sheet of thick, strong cardboard that you pay $3.99 for. And it will be the shape of the dagger, usually including the hilt and also including the handle and the pommel. So the simple version is you take the Chavant, get a soft Chavant clay. One that's good is NSP. It's NSP, stands for non-sulfur plasticine. They do an amazing one that's quite expensive now called Monumelt. But there's another clay that they should know about called, I think it's called Roma Plastina, which is soft, and you get the soft version of that. It's got sulfur in it, but that's fine. You only need the sulfur out of it if you're going to silicone mold it, which you're not going to do. All right. So once you have these really high-grade soft plasticines, you can get your child to shape them. You just mush it up, get it warm and soft, and then you apply it over the core. You know, tiny miniatures for gaming were made in this sort of clay. So you can get really detailed. If your child has talent, you'll watch them fly. There is a huge amount of talent out there if you give them professional materials, and that's one of the things that drives me forward. The thing I love about homeschooling and what I understand of it, and what I think, I was saying to my wife this morning, it's such a blessing because being able to take control of time. I don't believe in that whole siloed thing, and that everything's interconnected. And from what I've seen in the growth in these young men that I've worked with, amazing things are happening in their brains by us having very exploratory conversations.
It kind of segues something as homeschooling that we practiced ourselves, because our children wanted to go to university, but we were not doing the school qualification method. So we gained entrance for our high school teens via a discretionary entrance application. This is particularly applicable to New Zealanders, but in some way there will probably be overseas families who could also utilise this method.
Yes.
So if the university that you are wanting to apply to will accept applications not necessarily through the exam system, this is for you. So you can take your unsiloed subjects, because that's what homeschoolers are really good at. You can make a globe scaled. You can include English, obviously, because the globe belongs to Shakespeare. So you could satisfy what is required in a portion of the English curriculum. Now, we've done this, but it was in essay form. And all you need is the supervising high school teacher who understands the NCEA system and knows what is required. So for the globe's purposes, for an example, the English curriculum, what's in there that could it meet? Art, history, and maybe even, actually it would be easier, drop the art history for the globe. You could do it for the Colosseum, but for the globe I would go with history. You could potentially satisfy history credit requirements and
mathematics
and maths. I hadn't thought of that. That's a gem. So the key here is that you need guidance. Do not fly by the seat of your pants on this one, parents. You need to know exactly what you're doing here, because you can potentially meet a lot of your credit requirements through one fabulous, massive, detailed, time-dedicated project.
Yes, absolutely. You know, the level of learning that's going on and the enjoyment levels, I really believe that, from what I've seen, that enjoyment and learning are hugely interrelated, linked so strongly. Once you lose the enjoyment for the student, you're in troubled waters.
The vision that what we've just talked about, using the example of the globe, look, that's one of the big takeaways that I want the listeners to get today, and why I so believe that sculpting, as we've discussed, is not just a fun activity for your young ones and drop it when they're older. The other thing I was going to ask you about, Blair, I think you've done work with like stop motion and video, have you?
Yeah, a bit, yeah. And I've sort of almost come up with my own little innovations around that. And I'm not a trained animator, so I had to get very clever with some apps. And one of the applications I use is essentially abandonware.
Say that again.
Abandonware. Basically, there's one that I use for facial animation. I'd love to be doing a lot more of it with a lot more kids, where parents need a lot of help. I've always had a passion for a lot of things that kids are into, you know, so fantasy, anime, making things, Dungeons and Dragons, tabletop games, these things that a lot of kids are into and in the popular culture. But we can take those things and use them for learning across all, you know, everything. So I've been talking to someone who works with a young boy who has a really passionate interest in air conditioners. People might go, oh, why air conditioners? But think about the learning opportunities that is in terms of engineering, materials, mathematics, science, airflows, and all those things. And that's really where I think I want to see my work go. Say yes, and then do amazing things.
Homeschoolers, most of them, understand the concept of, like, let's go with your young boy who's got a heavy interest in air conditioning. The only gap I can see in that is I'd be hard pushed to find a literature book that would serve that. That's right, you'd find something else. The approach that we used in our own homeschooling, and homeschoolers might be familiar with this, is that we mostly used the Charlotte Mason approach. And if I can just give a very brief description of that, is that she would say take a book, she would call it a whole book or a living book, and mostly they were older books. Let's go with Little House on the Prairie. That will do fine. Within that book, or series as it actually is the opportunity for so many more subjects. So the siloed approach is even, I would say, alien to many homeschoolers. And it's difficult for them to even, especially the children who were not brought up with that kind of education, to when they feel sorry for the kids at school. I've heard them say that.
Okay.
Go back to the globe just for a minute. Let's just say that people had caught the vision of what they could do for that, for their older homeschooler. It could be for any age, but at the moment we're looking at focusing on those students who are looking to finish their education and service it for their future. And if they wanted to create the creatures, we'll say Midsummer Night's Dream, and they could create the media for that, couldn't they? And then that could also be, so long as it fell within the requirements of that, if they were doing an NCA one, they could also add that to the mix too, couldn't they? So potentially you could spend an entire year using this one amazing...
Absolutely. With the technology now, so there's a stop motion app, stop motion studio. And now where this gets really powerful is, what are the kids into, right? Well, you know, very often they're into collectibles, dolls, action figures. So there is such a thing as retrofitting an action figure into the character that you want it to be.
Can you explain that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like, for instance, I wanted to create, for a stop motion piece, I wanted to create Jesus as a centre character, right? I could look around, I could sculpt one from scratch, which I'm capable of doing, but that's a lot of time. Or I can go and say, oh, you know, remember those Lord of the Rings action figures? Gandalf, who's got that beautiful long robe. you can actually retrofit some of those things. And literally, you can take one head off if you're determined and put a different head on. Okay, find another face that's more youthful. Add a beard. You can use Super Sculpey for that, or Sculpey Primo even. You can sculpt it. You bake it in the oven at 130. Action figure head shouldn't melt. Should be fine. So I've done all this experimentation around how to get stuff up on the screen, and I'd love to do a lot of it with kids, because a lot of the times you don't have to be using the best software. I think there's a great preparation for the future world too, because AI is coming. It's already here. The days of modeling a character completely from scratch or sculpting it digitally completely from scratch, they may be numbered. You'll see now there's AI where you can just put in a description and there's even an app that'll create a piece of art for you. Kids 20 years from now as creators are going to have a lot of power. They're going to have apps that will do many things automatically, but some things in storytelling and understanding stories will never change. Certainly, I don't think the writing of stories that resonate with human beings will ever change.
Let's just ripple out from that. We're starting to mention more careers or prospects that could be benefited from what you're teaching. Let's focus on that for a little while to help parents and students see what else. So you've talked about AI. Let's get a little bit more specific. In some of the careers and things that you can see now, either on the way or here now.
Well, one I keep coming back to, and one of the reasons I want to build a makerspace like no other makerspace, is additive manufacturing and rapid prototyping, right? So a lot of things are going to need to be built and rebuilt. You think about the technologies that are on the horizon and how much investment is going to go into making completely new things. There's two things that currently are very expensive, but like all previous technologies, they're going to get more and more affordable. Okay, one is 3D printing, and the other one is the other one I mentioned, which is 5-axis CNC modeling, and I'll just explain what those are. 3D printing and filaments, as we see, usually just with small printers, that was the birth of the technology. But where the power is coming is 3D printing in metal, 3D printing in concrete and so on things. There's already a 3D printer. It's $100,000 US and it will print your parts in metal, which is a lot now, but 10 years from now, will it be 10,000? If you have a 5-axis CNC modeling machine, you can put your block of wood or your block of aluminium, even your block of steel in there. And based on your 3D model, it will carve out across 5 axes of movement from the block your beautiful figure or and so on. So I'm envisioning a makerspace where not only are the kids creating in clay and they're creating in all these materials I've mentioned, but then we can digitize their work and we can reproduce it, and that gives kids huge power. Right? We all talk about, why don't you design your own board game? Well, guess what? Now they only have to make one piece original, scan it, and they can print or mill as many as they want in multiple materials. Well, this stuff's coming, and when you're going back to careers, engineers, architects, all of these technical things, and we keep talking about STEM. But for me, you've got to get the numbers out of the books and you've got to give it a profound multi-sensory meaning to the learner. And so that's where I'm looking at these technologies, and I know what's coming. And this is sort of a thought experiment. If I'm wrong, I apologize. We'll find out in 10 or 20 years.
You're creative. You have the right to do this.
I'm envisioning a machine, and I've 3D modeled or imported where I need to these parts for my product. I mean, you think about what I have to do now. I need to get this prototype to a manufacturer, and that manufacturer is most likely not in New Zealand. Okay, what I can see converging with all these technologies that we have and machines that currently are expensive and do different things, is putting your model into this machine and 3D print it in the materials you want. And that's a manufacturing revolution. I'm sure I'm not the only person who said this. I imagine it's being talked about a lot, because look at houses. We're so focused on building houses, right, the traditional way. But isn't it just a matter of time before there's a mobile robotic factory that mainly will 3D print most of it on site for us, dig it most of it on site for us? Why would we not use technology to do that? And it will trickle down to our everyday lives, as it always has. Look at the last 50 years. So we're preparing our young people for, or we should be preparing them for.
I think we have done a superb job in convincing families why sculpting needs to stay in the curricula right through their homeschooling life. I did have a couple of questions regarding younger children, for just in case parents are thinking that it doesn't have a place for the young ones. What is a good starting point for younger children in sculpting as well?
Time for me to mention another clay. There's a couple of them. One's a little bit hard to get at the moment, but the other one will suffice as well, and you can get amazing work out of it. So I mentioned before Siobhan, that's an oil-based clay, okay, which is, it's not a fully permanent material. It always have a bit of a sticky feel, but you can spray it with a primer or a sealer, even just a cheap primer, and that'll seal it. Now, water-based clays, so there's an amazing one called WED, that stands for Walter E. Disney. And the story behind that is that when the Disney group and Walter Disney himself were building the Pirates of the Caribbean ride, they really needed a better clay for shaping the animatronics and the characters and so on. And so they formulated this one, which is still around, called WED. The reason I recommended it, smooths beautifully. When I'm starting kids around the 7-8 age, which is great, I will get them to do a face, just a face, it's like half a head, looking up at them. And where this is a really, really great cognitive exercise, in my view, a lot of the times when novice sculptors start, they sort of draw in 2 dimensions on the clay and have a very shallow depth of clay. I always emphasize, build a big depth of clay where you've got room to move in through the, back and forth through the face. You have to realize just how much depth there is in the human head, or if they're doing a lion's head, looking at the depth and being able to relate these 2 sources of information, join them together in their brain and understand the shape in the 3D and the round. The main ingredients for me are freedom, feeling safe to explore the medium, and no pressure to deliver something good. I have impressive reference material with me, but I never ever say to my students, I want you to do this. I say to them, you are in control. And there's a saying in sculpture that there are no rules, there are only tools. And when you give them that freedom, you give them the really good materials, and they don't feel pressure, often magic happens.
The modern artist has difficulty financing his life needs. How would you advise a student wanting to make art his career or her career?
I used to think of myself as solely an artist. And when we use that word, of course, it's so loaded with so much, cultural legacy and things like that. I would be very cautious about thinking that fine art is your one thing you're going to put 110% into. I can see stuff coming and it's already happening with apps and things like that. That's not to say that there won't always be fine artists who are extraordinary and are producing inspirational work. But the reason I think of myself as a creative is since I did my first oil paintings in my mid-20s and my first sculpture when I was 28, and I did this late, is that I have continued to add more creative skills to my bow. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. I studied performing arts for a year at 38 with kids half my age. I've got into digital design. I'm pretty much not a master, but very, very good in Photoshop. So I didn't just stop at one thing, physical materials, fine art. I think it's really important that you keep adding skills and making them relevant to employment. So that was something that once again happened quite late in my life. I got some corporate work, and suddenly all the stuff I'd been doing at home in my garage had a real place within a corporate environment. So I think be a creative, but don't get tunnel vision. That was my mistake for many years. I'm producing really great work. Everybody's been telling me how talented I am for the last 5 years. I'm going to go for Weta Workshop, and that's all that exists. And that was a fundamental strategic mistake.
Okay, so just recap over that. By all means, if you want to go work for Weta, make it a goal. But what else? Run over those things again.
Yeah, plan B, C, and D. So be a creative, not just a fine artist. Diversify your skills into digital media, performance media if you can, animation. And I know all the kids say, I want to be a YouTuber, but let's be honest. There's been a revolution that has happened for creatives and sources of income for them, because they've got digital skills, not just traditional media skills. The future is digital. This is my vision for the ultimate makerspace, or the ultimate, environment where kids will be able to get their foundation but then move it into digital, you need to keep adding skills.
So for somebody who wants to make this whole area of art, and we understand that it's quite broad and it has a depth to it. If a young adult can't break their way into that kind of career that they want, and they need to develop a parallel career happening at the same time, what are the skills and basic educational needs you would need to be able to support yourself and your family, pay off your student loan, whatever else you've got to do that may not necessarily be in the arts? How do you help somebody seriously consider and implement a holistic way beyond just the arts, but the very basic stuff?
In terms of like a young person looking ahead, it's a very, very hard question for me to answer because I'm sort of answering it from, I guess, my experience. I would say, though, that never abandon or devalue your creative skills. We're living in a world where even in relatively dry or entry-level corporate roles, there's always this place or a space for a bit of creative flair. I guess the other thing we should think about is written communication as well. I know part of my creative skill set was always an ability to write as well as improvise characters and do those sorts of things. So if it's not happening in one creative discipline, think more deeply about why you wanted to be an animator. Think deeply about what characters you like and what did you want to communicate to an audience. There are a lot of creative people, if we look across creative industries, who started as an animator or an art director. But no, now they're a writer or they're a director, right? So I really believe we all have a creative soul deep inside us. These disciplines are really how it manifests.
If I can ask you in conclusion, if you could time travel and go back to young Blair, on the cusp of leaving boyhood behind, entering into adulthood, what advice would you give him?
Well, that's an interesting and perhaps a bittersweet question for me. Obviously, I'm neurodiverse and I was a classic Asperger's kid. I didn't have I wasn't diagnosed, I didn't have a lot of support around me. So I think the first thing I would say to myself is it's okay and it's gonna be okay. I would say to myself that, there is versions of you that you just can't fathom or imagine. And that has come to fruition. Like I've been quite different people at different life stages. In terms of my social skills, my creative skills, my expression, all of that's happened at different times. And I think, as I would have said to that young boy, be bold and take risks. And I guess part of the tragedy for young people is they don't normally get told that. I mean, we've just been having a discussion, right, about students being told, don't take art. No, it's, and that's where I think if I'd just known how many risks I could take and actually how much could actually pay off early on. It's like the difference between an achievement mindset, you would have heard this, an achievement mindset and a training mindset, right? I would have totally got myself into an experiential and training mindset, and I do that with my students and just let the work develop and be at total peace as to whether the work is even good or bad, or we overvalue these definitions. And I'm sure this happens to, people who do the violin to a high level, or, even sports players, or perhaps even specialty sports players. It just starts to flow and you become a conduit for something greater than yourself.
That is such an encouraging way to finish, and it brings hope too for people. Blair, how can people see your work, learn more about you, contact you? Okay, great.
Well, first and foremost, my website, which I mentioned before, bartymaker.com. So yeah, that's BARTY at the beginning, and then maker.com. They can also email me, bartymaker@outlook.com. Instagram is bartymaker. Yeah, there's a few ways to get a hold of me. It's not going to be difficult.
It's not hard. Yeah.
It's not going to be difficult. Yeah.
Oh, Blair, thank you so much for your time, your encouragement, your honesty.
Oh, thank you.
And I hope to catch up with you again. We'll delve into a few of these subjects a bit deeper, and I'll be looking for feedback from the listeners too as to what to get you talking about again. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Christine. What a pleasure. Thank you.